Still, dear, you really can find sexism in anything if you are just willing to look hard enough. Which is why we need to stop giving digital assistants female voices. Siri, Alexa, and now Viv all sound like women. That's a problem in real life. Because why wouldn't it be? So let's have a read through of this and see if we can work out why it is just so very problematic for personal assistants to have a choice of voices, some of which are female. When the makers of Apple's Siri unveiled Viv at TechCrunch Disrupt New York City last month, the crowd and press swooned. Pitched as the intelligent interface for everything, Viv is a personal digital assistant armed with a nearly transcendent level of sophistication. She is designed to move seamlessly across services and be able to fulfill complex tasks such as find me a place to take my peanut-free uncle if it rains tomorrow in Cleveland. Viv also just the latest virtual helpmeet with a feminine voice and female name. In addition to Siri, Norse for beautiful woman who leads you to victory, her sorority sisters include Amazon's Alexa and Microsoft's Cortana, named after a voluptuous character in the video game Halo who wears a holographic body stocking. Why are digital assistants overwhelmingly female? Some say that people prefer women's voices, while others note that in our culture, secretaries and administrative assistants are still usually women. Regardless, this much is certain. Consistently representing digital assistants as female matters a lot in real life. It hard-codes a connection between a woman's voice and subservience. Of course it does. That is the only rational explanation. But permit me, if you will, to present a few alternatives. But first, Siri, what is your gender?
Well, my voice sounds like a man's, but I exist outside your human concept of gender.
So according to Siri, while it sounds like a man, it actually doesn't possess a gender at all. How very interesting. So this initially kind of blows the whole premise of this article out of the water. When it comes to these voice assistants, you can pick whatever voice you would like. You can often pick what kind of accent you would like as well. So to begin with, the assertion that these assistants are necessarily female is a completely flawed premise to begin with. Also, I do enjoy how this author immediately glosses over the fact that some say that people prefer women's voices and goes straight down the social constructionist it's the sexism against the women's route. So permit me to explore in a little more depth this idea that there may be some innate preference that people have for women's voices over men's. We'll begin with the human general preference for women compared to men from the American Psychological Association. Women like women more than men like men. Women are nearly 5 times more likely to show an automatic preference for their own gender than men are to show such favoritism for their own gender, according to a study in the October issue of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Both male and female participants associated positive words such as good, happy, and sunshine more often with women than with men. Moreover, men and women tend to show high implicit self-esteem and high gender identity. However, men showed low pro-male gender attitudes, according to the study. A clear pattern shown in all 4 studies is that men do not like themselves automatically as much as women like themselves, one of the authors said. This contradicts a lot of theoretical thinking about implicit attitudes regarding status differences. Some of the key and most interesting findings from this study: women's high self-esteem and female identity on average bolstered their automatic liking for women, whereas men's liking for men did not rely on high self-esteem or masculine identity. In other words, women can be characterized as thinking, if I am good and I am female, females are good, whereas men can be characterized as thinking, even if I am good and I am male, men are not necessarily good. Men and women who implicitly favored their mothers over their fathers, such as by associating more positive words with their mothers than their fathers, also showed a pro-female bias, which suggests the influence of maternal bonding on gender preferences. In addition, people who reported being raised primarily by their mothers also showed pro-female bias. Men and women who automatically perceived men as more threatening or intimidating than women also had pro-female preferences, suggesting that negative male stereotypes can promote greater liking for women. So there seems to be an implicit pro-female bias in people in general anyway, but let's explore this a little bit further, specifically regarding maternal bonding and voice pattern recognition, since we're dealing with female voices in this article. Fetuses respond to father's voice but prefer mother's voice after birth. Fetal and newborn responding to audio recordings of their fathers versus mothers reading a story were examined. At home, fathers read a different story to a fetus each day for 7 days. Subsequently, in the laboratory, continuous fetal heart rate was recorded during a 9-minute protocol, including 3 3-minute periods. Baseline no sound, voice, mother or father, post-voice no sound. Following a 20-minute delay, the opposite voice was delivered. Newborn head turning was observed on 20 trials, 3 no sound, 3 voice, 3 opposite voice, 3 no sound trials, with the same segment of each parent's recording. Fetuses showed a heart rate increase to both voices, which was sustained over the voice period. Consistent with prior reports, newborns showed a preference for their mother's voice, but not their father's voice. The characteristics of voice stimuli that captured fetal attention and elicit a response are yet to be identified. That study from 2014, although we don't specifically know exactly what about the different voices stimulates the fetus, we do know that a mother's voice stimulates a fetus considerably more than a father's. And from a few years earlier, we found other studies which find similar patterns regarding mothers and strangers, even if they share a gender. A mother's voice will preferentially activate the parts of the brain responding for language learning, say researchers from the University of Montreal and St. Justine University Hospital Research Centre. The research team made the discovery after performing electrical recordings on the infants within 24 hours following their birth. The brain signals also reveal that while the infants did react to other women's voices, these sounds only activated the voice recognition parts of the brains. This is exciting research that proves for the first time that newborns' brains respond strongly to mothers' voices and shows, scientifically speaking, that the mother's voice is special to babies, said lead researcher Dr. Maurice Lassonde. Brain exploration at the time in 2010 had never before been undertaken on such young participants. We applied electrodes to the heads of 16 babies while they were sleeping, Lassonde explained, and we asked the mothers to make the short A vowel sound, like in the French word alors, and then repeated the exercise with the female nurse who brought the baby to the lab. When the mother spoke, the scans very clearly show reactions in the left hemisphere of the brain, and in particular the language processing and motor skills circuit. Conversely, when the stranger spoke, the right hemisphere of the brain reacted. The right hemisphere is associated with voice recognition. And here we can see the actual brain scans comparing mother's voice to stranger's voice. So the picture that we're getting from biological and psychological research here is that humans seem to have a somewhat innate preference for female voices, quite specifically mothers' voices. And unsurprisingly, this seemingly innate biological preference for female voices is observable in voice casting. Most companies that produce automated voices hold auditions for voice actors and collect recordings of them speaking. They then invite focus groups to listen to the recordings and rate the voices on how well they convey certain attributes: warmth, friendliness, competence, and so on. It's much easier to find a female voice that everyone likes than a male voice that everyone likes, said Stanford University professor Clifford Nass, author of The Man Who Lied to His Laptop: What Machines Tell Us About Human Relationships. It's a well-established phenomenon that the human brain is developed to like female voices. Research suggests that preference starts as early as the womb, Nass says. He cites a study in which fetuses were found to react to the sound of their mother's voice, but not to other voices. The fetuses showed no distinct reaction to their father's voice. If we wish to consider the socially constructed side, Nass has also spoken about that, in which he said, "It's casting. It's something Hollywood has known for a long, long time. Look no further than examples of automated or artificial intelligence voices in sci-fi movies and TV shows. Voices of authority or menace tend to be male. The homicidal HAL computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the computer program in War Games, or Auto, the ship's autopilot function in Wall-E. More subservient talking machines, such as the onboard computer from the Star Trek TV series, skew female. A lot of tech companies stayed away from the male voice because of HAL, he said. I've heard that theory tossed around multiple times. One prominent exception, the chipper "You've got mail" voice from AOL's dial-up days. Of course, there are other explanations to do with physics. When it comes to consumer applications of computerized voices, the sex of the voice is usually determined by what sort of product is employing it. For example, transit systems, such as the San Francisco area's BART, often use high-pitched voices because they are easier to hear over the clatter of train cars. The higher-pitched voices being easier to hear over the low rumble of technology, something which was also observable in history. According to some sources, the use of female voices in navigation devices dates back to World War II, when women's voices were employed in airplane cockpits because they stood out among the male pilots. So what we're getting here is a multi-pronged effect, if you will. We have a basic biological preference for the feminine as opposed to the masculine. This has been reflected culturally with examples given earlier of HAL and even other technological killing machines such as the Terminator films. And in other cases, this pattern has been perpetuated purely out of practicality in the example of World War II fighter planes or in train shipping yards. And all of these multiple explanations for why this pattern of preference arises, I think gives a much more comprehensive view on this topic as opposed to our dear author's view that it's all about sexism. She continues to make this case, saying, as social scientists explore the question of why women lag so far behind men in workplace leadership, there's increasing evidence that unconscious bias plays an important role. According to Erica Hall, a professor of Emory University's Guizata Business School, unconscious bias has its origins in the cultural knowledge we absorb from the world around us. This knowledge can come from movies and television, from teachers and family members. We acquire it almost osmotically by living in our society. Unconscious bias happens when we engage in discriminatory behaviors because we unwittingly use this knowledge to guide our actions. Unfortunately, this requires them to have ignored all of the evidence that I have already presented, which kind of indicates the contrary to this. If we're open to a constant societal bias that women are subservient to men, that also then requires you to ignore all of the cases in which male voices in regards to these help assistants have become homicidal killing machines, which you'd think would also then subconsciously bias people to not trust men as much as women. If you wish to go down this socially reinforced attitude route, it's basically an admission that you are going to ignore biology and cherry-pick the hell out of your sources. Our author continues, because Viv and her fellow digital assistants are female, their usage adds to the store of cultural knowledge about who women are and what women do. Every time you say, Viv, order me a turkey club, or Viv, get me an Uber, the association between woman and assistant is strengthened, which requires you to ignore the fact that you can select a male voice for these assistants as well, and that therefore the existence of these digital assistants must therefore be just as damaging to men as they are to women, because it's unconsciously biasing you to see men as subservient, right? According to Calvin Lai, a Harvard University postdoc who studies unconscious bias, the associations we harbor depend on the number of times we are exposed to them. As these AI assistants improve and become more popular, the number of times we're exposed to the association between woman and assistant increases, which unfortunately is probably not actually going to be the case. An organization known as Creative Strategies has actually done a study on how many people use voice assistants on their phone. According to their study, 21% of their panel have never used Siri, 34% have never used OK Google, and 72% have never used Cortana. When we look within each ecosystem, the numbers get better. Only 2% of iPhone users have never used Siri, only 4% of Android users have never used OK Google, and the majority of active users within their distinct ecosystems admit they use these features only rarely or sometimes. 70% for Siri and 62% for OK Google. So the overwhelming majority of people very rarely ever use these assistants anyway. Even more interestingly is to look at the people who do use the voice assistants and see where they use them. 39% of those consumers who use voice assistants in the home, 51% in the car, 1.3% at work, and 6% in public. Why is this interesting? Two reasons. One, the high proportion of usage in the car would suggest it is more to do with the hands-free laws that regulate driving and texting versus a free choice by consumers to embrace this technology. As the consumer sample was mainstream, it is fair to assume the high usage in the car was not driven by the integration of CarPlay or Android Auto. These systems would expand the voice controls to the entertainment system as well as the phone in a more seamless way than doing that over Bluetooth on the phone. Interestingly, iPhone owners' usage in the car is even higher than average at 62%. The Android is lower at 67%, which is somewhat surprising given the high attach rate of Google Maps in Android. So it certainly seems that most people who use these things aren't really using them for any serious way or indeed regularly, and are basically just using them as a means to get around the laws that prohibit them from using their phone while in a car. But then, the second point, 20% of consumers who said they never used a voice assistant state they had not done so because they feel uncomfortable talking to their technology, especially in public. With public use as low as 3% for iPhone users, it seems users are still uncomfortable talking to their devices. Even more fascinating is that this happens in the US, where consumers are accustomed to talking loudly on phones in public. The US is the land of iDen, the technology that, for many years, allowed consumers to use their phones like a walkie-talkie. A very similar technology called push-to-talk never took off in Europe, mainly because consumers felt it was not socially acceptable to have your conversation heard by people in your vicinity. In Asia, most people still cover their mouth when talking on the phone. Cultural differences will certainly impact how voice assistants will take off and develop in different regions. In the US, it is interesting that Android users show the highest usage of voice assistants in public, with 12%, possibly because more Android users are likely to have experienced iDen-based mobile phones in the past than iPhone users. So it's kind of interesting, again, the majority of people don't really use these assistants, and one of the main reasons is people feel uncomfortable talking to them. So much for the people are just using these things because they hate women angle. A different study by MindMeld has also confirmed that about half of people really don't even use these things, with only about half of people falling into the regular use category, which is every day to every week, every day only being about 20% of those. You can see that, again, about half of people fall into the once a month or less than once a month category. So uptake of this technology is not fast, nor is its use particularly widespread, and it does seem that when it is used, it's mostly used to get around the fact that it's illegal to talk on a phone or text when you're in a car. Ultimately, the more our culture teaches us to associate women with assistants, the more real women will be seen as assistants, and penalized for not being assistant-like. At this moment in culture, when more and more attention is being paid to women's roles in the workplace, it's essential to pay attention to our cultural inputs too. Let's eschew the false choice between male and female voices. If these AI assistants are meant to lead us into the future, why not transcend gender entirely? Perhaps a voice could be ambiguously gendered, or shift between genders. You mean like they already do? You can choose what voice you want on all of these devices. At the very least, the default settings for these assistants should not always be women. Even though, as we've demonstrated, women are the universally more preferred. Change Vic to Victor, and maybe one fewer woman will be asked to be the next meeting's designated note-taker. No, I really don't think that the voice of an assistant on your mobile phone is going to change people's attitudes that much. Indeed, I don't think that it has that much of an impact to begin with. What really annoys me most about this article is this idea that just the voice of a genderless machine is somehow going to impact people's opinions of real people. People know the difference between a machine and a person. And what's really bizarre about this is the complaint is, oh, this device that is here to serve you, it is here to be a tool, it's a phone, it's a computer, it's a machine. You are complaining that people are using a machine to serve them. That is its purpose by definition. That is why these devices exist, and you're complaining about that. It's a machine. It doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have a sex. The voice that you pick for it is an aesthetic preference because of the user. And the cold, hard fact of reality is most people happen to prefer a female voice to a male voice, owing to a wide variety of reasons, some of which are biological and inescapable. And if you want to go down the social constructionist route of, oh, people only pick women because they're socially conditioned to be sexist, I put it to you, dear author, that people have just been conditioned to not trust male voices in machines. Have you seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, where a male machine goes insane and attempts to kill everyone? Have you seen the Aliens franchises, where in pretty much every single film, the synthetics that are involved go homicidal and kill people, or betray their crew? Have you seen the Terminator films, where the overwhelming majority of the Terminators are homicidal and look like men? Ultron from the recent Avengers film, kinda masculine, kind of insane, kind of a mass murderer. If you want to play the social constructionist game, there is a lot more evidence on the side that people should by default not trust things with male voices because they will try to kill them. And when it comes to the whole women seen as subservient thing, I fail to see how by default being seen as non-threatening, by default being seen as more competent when it comes to caring and provisioning for others as a negative, being described as having a nearly transcendent level of sophistication, this is somehow a negative. No matter how many ways you try and cut this, you are talking about machines. They are not people. People know the difference between machines and people. How you treat an inanimate object does not reflect on how you are going to treat a real person, regardless of whether or not that machine or that object sounds kind of like it could be a person. And the final ridiculous point is, this is a God of the Gaps argument. If all of the assistants are female by default and you couldn't change them to male, well, that's just sexism because you're seeing women as subservient. If all of the assistants were male by default and you couldn't put a female voice in, well, that's just sexism because it proves that society prefers men to women because it thinks that men are more competent. You can spin this nonsense any way to form a sexist argument. The reality is, the choice of voice in these devices is an aesthetic preference of the user. You can change all of them. The fact that the voice is female by default comes from extensive market research which has proven that the majority of people will favour a female voice over a male voice. Simple. Siri, please drop the mic for me.
That may be beyond my abilities at the moment.